Alright, so let's talk a little bit about Mesopotamia and Egypt. This is kind of referred to as the ancient Near East, and it refers to the area in the Middle East and where current-day Egypt is. So Mesopotamia is a large crescent-shaped band of fertile land in the Middle East. And it was the land between two rivers, Tigris and the Euphrates, called the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent kind of refers to the fact that because of the rivers and the way that they flooded and whatnot, it filled that area with a ton of fertile land, perfect for farming. The land's also called Mesopotamia, which means the land between two rivers. And large cities started to form in this area, specifically around Sumer, in about 3000 BC. In Sumer, there was a pretty distinct social hierarchy or social classes. The ruling family was on top with the king and his officials and the priests, then the merchants and the artisans, then the peasant farmers, and then lastly the slaves. The Sumerians also practiced polytheism, or the worship of lots and lots of gods. They also believed that these gods had ruled over natural forces like flooding, the sun, and so they had offered them sacrifices as a way to try to manipulate the weather. What you see here on the left is actually a ziggurat. And if you can tell, the ziggurat has lots of different windows and whatnot, so it worked as a palace, but it also was a temple. The blue box on top is a temple to those polytheistic gods. The Sumerians are almost most famous for their first form of writing called cuneiform. They used a reed pen to make wedge-shaped marks on clay tables. You can see behind us that this is a form of cuneiform, so it had like a triangle type shape. It was essentially a stylus that was used to make this. They also developed a math system based on the number 60, so they started dividing hours into 60 minutes and a circle into 360 degrees, which we still do today. The Sumerians also had learned to use geometry that was necessary to build elaborate structures and irrigation systems, which helped them to engineer major agricultural and architectural features into their civilization. One of the main leaders in Babylon, which was one of the cities in Mesopotamia, was Hammurabi. He had developed a really harsh set of law codes known as the Code of Hammurabi. This was the first attempt to create a system of laws that would govern the state, and it really helped to unify his empire because everybody was now dictated by these laws. During his rule, he also started to make some reforms to the government. He organized an army, he encouraged religious unity, and also created a system of taxation to help build public works. The Chaldeans, after Hammurabi, had revived the power of Babylon because it had kind of started to decline after Hammurabi died. Their leader, Nebuchadnezzar, had created a really large empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, and he also encouraged learning and astronomy, but he was most famous for the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which are actually not able to be seen today, but are still considered one of the 7 wonders of the world. Phoenicia, which was in the western part of Mesopotamia along the Mediterranean Sea, also started to emerge as a center of trade. The Phoenicians depended upon trade in the sea because there was little farming available because they were farther away from the Tigris and Euphrates River. They started to also establish colonies along the coast because they started to travel via boats and whatnot. And they also were responsible for the first alphabet, the Phoenician alphabet. So the Mesopotamians were also for the first writing system, cuneiform, and also the very first alphabet, the Phoenician alphabet. So eventually the Mesopotamian Empire starts to emerge into the Persian Empire, and so the Persians were able to accomplish unification under Darius, who had built and repaired roads to start to increase communication. He also built a mail system, and this helped to unify the empire. And so as a part of that, he also set up a money economy to create more of a standard for trade. And so goods and services started to be paid for through the exchange of tokens or coins. Also during this time, Zoroastrianism was the very first monotheistic religion that emerged in the Persian Empire. It was based on Zoroaster, who rejected the Persian polytheism. Ahura Mazda was the god of Zoroastrianism, and he was a single wise god who was constant in battle against Ahriman, the prince of lies and evil, so God and the devil. People had to pick which side that they were going to be loyal to. The other monotheistic religion that emerged in Mesopotamia was Judaism. Hebrews, who are now also referred to as the Jews, recorded a lot of their events in the Torah, which becomes their holy book. Judaism started with Abraham, who is considered the founder and had migrated to Canaan because of a covenant he had with God. The famine then caused the Israelites and the Hebrews to move to Egypt, and then eventually they moved back to Israel because King David emerges as their leader. The Israelites eventually fell to the Assyrians and the Chaldeans, and they forced the Israelites into exile in Babylon, which referred to as the Babylonian captivity. So at that point, the Jews were all kept in Babylon, which we'd previously talked about with Nebuchadnezzar. And so this was really the start of the Jewish diaspora. This means that Jews started to spread outside of Judah, outside of the Middle East, and moving into Europe and other parts of the world. Judaism is also one of the first monotheistic religions after Zoroastrianism, and at the very heart of Judaism is the Ten Commandments, which is a set of laws that help to unify the Jews based on the strong belief in righteousness and justice as an adherence to the Ten Commandments. So the next kingdom we're going to talk about is Egypt. Egypt also emerged around a river valley, the Nile River, and it was one of the most important features because, again, this river provided the fertile land for the agriculture that was needed. People started to build dikes, which is kind of like a dam, reservoirs and irrigation ditches, trying to make sure that water could be stored and also used for farming. Egypt was broken into two main regions, Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. So these seemed flipped, but the important thing to know about the Nile River is this is the only river in the entire world that flows northward. So it flows from Upper Egypt to Lower Egypt instead of from Lower Egypt to Upper Egypt. Lower Egypt is in northern Egypt, and it's located a part of the Nile Delta. This is where agriculture was going to be at its peak. Upper Egypt is in southern Egypt, and it has a lot of rocky parts to it and rapids, and so they're not quite as well known for their farming. Menes is the king of Upper Egypt. He started to unite the two regions, and he used the Nile to link them and create a trade route. So there's three main periods of ancient Egypt: Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. In the Old Kingdom, you have your stereotypical Egypt with the pharaohs, believing that the pharaohs was a god. They had a dynasty which passed from power to power to power as a part of a monarchy. And it also was the time period in which the pyramids were used. The Middle Kingdom is kind of in the middle there, and it's not a time period that most people know too much about. The pharaoh lost a ton of power. There was a lot of political instability, and people in Nubia, which was right below the Upper Kingdom, started to rise to power as well, and they fell to the Hyksos, and that eventually drove them out and created the New Kingdom, in which the pharaohs decided to try to protect Egypt. They started creating more of a buffer land, and this is where we get some of those powerful rulers that we know about today, Queen Hatshepsut and Ramses II, who were the first female to rule and also kind of expanded the empire. So Egyptians overall are polytheistic. They also believe that these gods are in charge of the natural resources. They started to build temples to honor their gods, which were very featured by obelisks, which are tall, thin pillars with pyramids at the top. They believe that in the afterlife, and so they mummified their dead, trying to prepare them for that process. They also developed a system of writing, but it was a little bit different than the Mesopotamians because they used hieroglyphics, which were ideographs. So they were pictures of certain things to represent ideas. Over time, they developed demotic, which was a simpler form of writing. They also started to use papyrus, so paper-like material, to record their writing systems. And they also created the Rosetta Stone, which was a large black stone that had all three systems of writing on there. It had hieroglyphics, demotic, and Greek, so now we can understand all of the things that were written by the Egyptians. Egyptians made a lot of advances, particularly in medicine and science. Because of the fact that they were mummifying people, they started to make observations in symptoms, diagnoses, surgery, and all the different medicines. They also started to chart the stars as a way to keep up with a calendar, and they also used geometry. They're also super famous for frontalism, which was the painting seen below, where they had a frontal-facing figure with the head turned to the side. Thanks for joining me, and that was Mesopotamian Egypt.